Berlin, April 1945. Soviet artillery thunders in the distance. Deep beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, in the cramped concrete corridors of the Führerbunker, a heavyset doctor prepares his morning routine. For nearly 9 years, Theodor Morell has been at Adolf Hitler's side, administering daily injections of vitamins, hormones, stimulants, and substances far more potent. He has become indispensable to the Führer, the man who keeps the crumbling dictator functioning through defeat after catastrophic defeat. But on 22nd April, Hitler turns on him with sudden fury. Morell reaches for his medical bag, ready to administer another injection, but Hitler seizes his arm and screams that the doctor is trying to sedate him, to render him unconscious, so others might spirit him away from Berlin. The relationship that made Morell one of the most influential figures in the Third Reich ends in a single, explosive moment. Within hours, the doctor who knew more about Hitler's health than any living person boards one of the last flights out of Berlin, clutching an army footlocker containing years of meticulous medical records. What follows is a story of capture, interrogation, and quiet decline, the final chapter of the man who turned the Führer into one of history's most notorious drug addicts. The story of Theodor Morell begins not in the bunkers of Berlin, but in the quiet village of Treis-Münzenberg in Upper Hesse, where he was born on 20 July 1886. His father was a primary school teacher, his mother from a prosperous farming family. Young Theodor suffered from chronic stomach cramps as a child, a curious parallel to the ailment that would one day bind him to the most powerful man in Europe. Despite frequent illness, he excelled academically, graduating with such distinction that he was exempted from oral examinations. He trained briefly as a teacher before pursuing medicine at the University of Heidelberg, where he again achieved top marks. Further studies took him to Grenoble and Paris, and he completed his doctoral degree in obstetrics and gynecology in Munich on 23 May 1913. Morell's early career was eclectic. He worked as a ship's doctor on ocean liners sailing to South America, where he claimed to have gained experience treating tropical diseases. When war broke out in 1914, he volunteered for military service, serving first as a battalion medical officer on the Western Front, and later at a prisoner of war camp in Ohrdruf, Thuringia. By 1918, the war was over, and Morell established a private practice in Berlin on the fashionable Bayreutherstrasse. In 1919, he married Johanna Moller, a wealthy actress who would remain his confidant and business partner until his death. With her fortune, Morell furnished his practice with the latest medical equipment and targeted his unconventional treatments at Berlin's elite. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Morell cultivated a reputation as a physician to the rich and famous. He specialized in skin conditions and venereal diseases, a lucrative combination in an era when sexually transmitted infections carried intense social stigma and sufferers were willing to pay handsomely for discretion. He earned the nickname Dr. Kurfürstendamm after the fashionable Berlin street where his office stood. His patients included actors, businessmen, and even foreign royalty. Both the Shah of Persia and the King of Romania reportedly invited him to become their personal physician, offers he declined because he preferred his comfortable Berlin lifestyle. Morell claimed to have studied under Ilya Ilyich Mechnikov, the Nobel Prize-winning Russian biologist who pioneered research into the immune system and probiotics. This claim, like many aspects of Morell's carefully constructed reputation, was difficult to verify. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Morell joined the Nazi Party, a practical decision that would prove extraordinarily lucrative. His path to the Führer's inner circle began in 1935, when he successfully treated Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, for gonorrhea. Hoffmann was effusive in his praise, telling Hitler that Morell had saved his life. Around the same time, Morell also treated Franziska Braun, the mother of Hitler's mistress Eva Braun. Through these connections, Morell gained an invitation to spend Christmas 1936 at the Obersalzberg with the Hoffmanns, who suggested a visit to Hitler at his nearby Berghof residence. Hitler had suffered for years from chronic stomach cramps that no physician could cure. He was also plagued by a stubborn leg rash and persistent flatulence that embarrassed him at official functions. At a quiet moment during the Christmas gathering, Hitler approached Morell and asked if he could help. Morell diagnosed complete exhaustion of the intestinal system and promised a cure within a year. He prescribed a combination of vitamins, hormones, phosphorus and dextrose, along with Mutaflor, a preparation containing a EO strain of E. coli bacteria said to restore healthy intestinal flora. To Hitler's amazement, his symptoms improved dramatically. The leg rash disappeared. the stomach cramps subsided. By 1937, Morell had been appointed one of Hitler's personal physicians, beginning a relationship that would last until the final days of the war. Hitler's faith in Morell became absolute. When other doctors questioned Morell's methods, Hitler defended him fiercely. Karl Brandt, who had been Hitler's accompanying physician since 1934, repeatedly warned that Morell's excessive injections risked poisoning the Führer. Hitler dismissed these concerns. The rivalry between Brandt and Morell became one of the recurring tensions within Hitler's inner circle, with Brandt representing conventional medical practice and Morell embodying an approach that mixed genuine medicine with quackery and commercial exploitation. Brandt was younger, handsome, and well-connected in German medical circles. He had performed surgery on Hitler's associates and enjoyed considerable prestige. But Morell had something Brandt lacked, results that Hitler could feel immediately after each injection. "No one has ever told me precisely what is wrong with me," Hitler said. Morell's method of cure is so logical that I have the greatest confidence in him. I shall follow his prescriptions to the letter. Later, he would remark, "What luck I had to meet Morell. He has saved my life." This unwavering trust made Morell virtually untouchable, despite the contempt he inspired among Hitler's inner circle. Morell's appearance and personal habits repulsed many in the Nazi hierarchy. He was heavyset, sweated profusely, suffered from halitosis, and emitted a distinctive body odor that even Eva Braun found difficult to tolerate. His table manners were crude. Christa Schroeder, Hitler's personal secretary, described him as corpulent, with hair sprouting from his ears and cuffs, and exotic rings on his thick fingers. Hermann Göring mockingly called him der Reichsspritzenmeister, the Reich Master of Injections, a nickname that stuck. Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer considered him a quack. But when anyone complained to Hitler, the response was always the same: "I do not employ him for his fragrance, but to look after my health." As the war progressed, Morell's treatments became increasingly aggressive. What began as relatively harmless vitamin injections evolved into a complex regimen of dozens of medications, many of which are now known to be toxic or highly addictive. The broader context of drug use in Nazi Germany helps explain how such treatments became normalized. Despite the regime's public rhetoric about purity and clean living, methamphetamine use was widespread throughout the Third Reich. The pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werk had introduced Pervitin, a methamphetamine pill, in 1938, and it quickly became popular among German civilians and military personnel alike during the 1940 Blitzkrieg campaign against France. The Wehrmacht distributed some 35 million Pervitin tablets to soldiers, enabling them to march and fight for days without sleep. The drug's side effects, including paranoia, aggression, and severe withdrawal symptoms, eventually led to restrictions. But by then, the culture of pharmaceutical enhancement was deeply embedded in German military and civilian life. Morell kept meticulous records in his medical diary, documenting every substance he administered to Patient A, his code name for Hitler. The list eventually grew to include some 74 different substances in 28 different mixtures. Among them were Pervitin, a methamphetamine that had been widely distributed to German soldiers during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns; Eucadal, an opioid based on oxycodone; cocaine, administered as eye drops and nasal applications; testosterone and other hormones; preparations derived from animal organs including bull testicles; and a bewildering array of vitamins, tonics, and bacterial cultures. The centerpiece of Morell's treatment was Vitamultin, a preparation he marketed under his own brand name and manufactured in factories he owned. He claimed it was simply a vitamin compound, but when samples were secretly tested by Ernst Günther Schenk, a nutrition inspector for the Waffen-SS, they were found to contain methamphetamine. Hitler would receive a Vitamultin injection each morning, after which he would spring from bed with renewed energy and alertness. The injections helped him endure the grueling schedule of military conferences, kept him awake during endless nighttime meetings, and masked the symptoms of whatever underlying conditions were causing his decline. By 1943, Hitler was receiving multiple injections daily, sometimes as many as 20. His adjutant Heinz Linger observed that the morning injection transformed Hitler from a tired, shuffling old man into someone alert, lively, and ready to face the new day. Morell profited enormously from his position. Beyond his fees as Hitler's physician, he built a pharmaceutical empire that supplied products to the German armed forces. Since 1935, he had held a 50% stake in Hammer GmbH, a pharmaceutical company in Hamburg. He sat on the supervisory boards of Hageder, the Berlin firm that manufactured Mutterflor, and Chinoan, a Budapest company that produced a largely ineffective sulfonamide preparation called Ultraseptal. During the war, he acquired additional factories in the occupied Sudetenland and Moravia, where he manufactured hormone preparations, vitamin concentrates, and a delousing powder called Russia lice powder that was made compulsory for the armed forces. He leveraged his relationship with Hitler to sell Vitamultin to the German Labour Front and other mass organizations. By the height of the war, Morell had become a wealthy man, owning a villa on Schwanenwerder Island in Berlin, a property in the Baltic resort of Heringsdorf, and a lakefront house in Hamburg. The moral dimensions of Morell's business dealings extended beyond mere profiteering. Some of his pharmaceutical enterprises were acquired from Jewish owners forced to sell during the Nazi persecution. His factory in Moravia relied on supplies of animal organs from slaughterhouses across occupied Ukraine, obtained through a monopoly arrangement with occupation authorities. American investigators who examined his facilities after the war found descriptions of appalling hygienic conditions, with livers arriving foul after weeks in railway cars delayed by Soviet bombing. The manufacture of preparations from such materials and their administration to any patient, let alone the leader of a warring nation, raised serious questions about Morell's judgment and ethics. As Germany's military fortunes declined, Hitler's health deteriorated rapidly. By 1943, Morell observed tremors in Hitler's left arm and leg, a dragging of the left foot that, suggested the onset of Parkinson's disease. The stress of defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa appeared to accelerate his decline. Hitler complained constantly of stomach pain, headaches, dizziness, tinnitus, and double vision. His skin took on a sallow, greyish pallor. Morell responded by increasing the dosages and adding new substances to the regimen. In mid-1943, he began administering Eukodal, a powerful opioid to manage Hitler's pain. The drug produced euphoria and relief, but also carried a high risk of addiction. Morell's involvement in one of the most dramatic moments of the pre-war period came in March 1939, during the forced annexation of Czechoslovakia. When Czechoslovak President Emil Hácha arrived in Berlin to meet with Hitler, the Führer subjected him to a terrifying tirade, demanding immediate capitulation. Hácha, elderly and in poor health, became so frightened that he fainted. Morell was summoned and injected stimulants to revive him. The doctor later claimed these were only vitamins, but they may well have included methamphetamine. Within hours of receiving the injection, Hácha signed away his country's independence. It was a small but telling episode in Morell's career, demonstrating how his medical interventions could serve the regime's political objectives. The 20th of July 1944 assassination attempt at the Wolf's Lair headquarters left Hitler with perforated eardrums, splinter wounds, and temporary hearing loss. Dr. Erwin Giesing, an ear, nose, and throat specialist brought in to treat the injuries, began administering cocaine through drops and swabs to relieve pain and clear Hitler's sinuses. Over the following weeks, Hitler received cocaine treatments on some 50 occasions. Giesing also grew suspicious of Morell's methods and secretly analysed some of the anti-gas pills Hitler was taking in large quantities. He found they contained strychnine and belladonna, concluding that the strychnine was causing jaundice and other symptoms. When Giesing reported his findings to Karl Brandt and Hans-Karl von Hasselbach, Hitler's other physicians, they attempted to intervene. Hitler was furious. He dismissed all three doctors, declaring his total faith in Morell. Brandt, who had served Hitler since the early days of power, was later arrested, imprisoned, and ultimately executed at the Nuremberg doctors' trial for his involvement in the Nazi euthanasia program. By April 1945, Hitler was taking 28 different pills daily, along with numerous injections. The Allied bombing of German pharmaceutical facilities, including the Merck plant in Darmstadt in December 1944, disrupted Morell's supply chains. He could no longer obtain adequate quantities of Eukodal and other substances Hitler had come to depend upon. The effects of withdrawal, combined with the stress of Germany's imminent collapse, pushed Hitler into an increasingly erratic mental state. Those who saw him in the bunker during these final weeks described a man who appeared decades older than his 56 years, stooped, trembling, shuffling through the corridors like a living corpse. The relationship between doctor and patient that had survived nearly 9 years of daily contact ended abruptly on 22 April 1945. By that date, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin, and Hitler had made clear he would not leave the city. In the bunker's close quarters, paranoia flourished. Hitler had refused evacuation, convinced that staying in Berlin was the only honorable course. But others in his entourage were desperate to escape. Morell entered Hitler's study to administer the customary injection. According to his own diary, Hitler grabbed his arm, went pale with rage, and accused the doctor of trying to sedate him so he could be removed from Berlin against his will. Hitler ordered Morell to leave, to take off his uniform and return to his practice on the Kurfürstendamm as if they had never met. Shattered by the dismissal, Morell gathered his belongings, including the footlocker containing Hitler's complete medical records, and made his way to Tempelhof Airport. On 23rd of April, Morell boarded a Focke-Wulf FW200 Condor, one of the last aircraft to leave Berlin before Soviet forces completely encircled the city. The flight carried him southwest toward Munich. He was in poor health himself, suffering from heart problems exacerbated by the stress of the confrontation and his terror of flying. Upon landing, he was immediately taken to a clinic in Munich. A week later, on 30th May, the same day that Berlin officially fell and Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their children in the bunker before killing themselves, Morell was transferred to a hospital in Bad Reichenhall in the Bavarian Alps. American forces captured the area 2 days later. Morell's wife Johanna visited him in the hospital and found a broken man, weeping and confused. On 18th May 1945, soldiers of the American Third Army searching for former SS officers and other high-value detainees arrived at his bedside. The man who had been one of the most influential physicians in the Third Reich was now a prisoner. His interrogators reportedly found him disgusting, a grossly obese figure with poor hygiene, who bore no resemblance to the powerful shadow advisor he had once been. The Americans were intensely interested in what he knew about Hitler's health, his mental state in the final years, and the medical records he had so carefully preserved. American military intelligence conducted extensive interrogations of Morell beginning in September 1945. A Vienna-born medical technician named Hermann Merl was pressed into service as the primary interrogator, producing detailed notes that would later inform the classified report known as Hitler as Seen by His Doctors. Morell cooperated fully, describing his treatments, his observations of Hitler's deteriorating health, and the complex web of medications he had administered. When asked about the penicillin he had used to treat Hitler's injuries after the July 1944 assassination attempt, he claimed complete ignorance of the drug's origins, though it had only recently been introduced by the US Army. Some members of Hitler's inner circle later alleged that Morell had owned a stake in a company fraudulently marketing a product as penicillin, though this was never definitively proven. The interrogators were especially interested in Hitler's mental state during the final years of the war. Morell's observations suggested a man with a split personality, as the doctor put it, alternating between iron will and paralyzing depression. He described Hitler's pathological secrecy, his refusal to allow thorough medical examinations, and his extraordinary shyness about undressing in front of physicians. He confirmed the tremors, the shuffling gait, the increasingly erratic behavior. The intelligence officers took careful notes, aware they were gathering information that might never be available from any other source. Hitler was dead. Many of the bunker's other occupants had perished or disappeared. Morell, for all his flaws, had witnessed the dictator's decline more closely than perhaps anyone else alive. The Americans held Morell at an internment camp established on the grounds of the former Dachau concentration camp. The irony of the location was not lost on observers. The same site where the Nazi regime had imprisoned and killed thousands now housed former members of that regime awaiting judgment. For a time, Morell shared a cell with Karl Brandt, his former rival, and American intelligence listened in on their conversations. Later, Morell was transferred to the former Luftwaffe interrogation center at Oberursel, where more sophisticated questioning continued. Throughout his captivity, Morell's health continued to deteriorate. He was grossly obese, suffered from cardiovascular problems related to lifelong syphilis and heavy smoking, and began experiencing speech impairments that left him mumbling incoherently. Despite his proximity to Hitler and his extensive knowledge of the inner workings of the Nazi regime, Morell was never charged with war crimes. His role had been purely medical, and while he had profited enormously from his position, he had not been directly involved in the atrocities that formed the basis of the Nuremberg prosecutions. His membership in the Nazi Party was viewed as opportunistic rather than ideological. He had not participated in the criminal medical experiments conducted by SS doctors. He had not been part of the euthanasia program. He was simply a physician who had treated Hitler, administered drugs of questionable value, and enriched himself in the process. On 30th of June 1947, after more than 2 years in American custody, Morell was released from the internment camp at Dachau. The decision to release him reflected the broader trajectory of American denazification policy, which by 1947 was shifting toward rehabilitation and reconstruction, as Cold War priorities took precedence over exhaustive prosecution of lesser figures. Morell had cooperated fully with his interrogators. He had provided valuable intelligence about Hitler's health and mental state. He had not been implicated in war crimes or crimes against humanity. There was little to be gained by continuing to hold him. He was 60 years old in advanced ill health and possessed nothing of the fortune he had accumulated during the war years. His pharmaceutical enterprises had been seized or destroyed. His properties were gone. The business assets he had so carefully built were worthless. The Americans placed him on a stretcher at the Munich railway station, dressed in used American Army fatigues, and left him there. A nurse discovered him and arranged for his transfer to the district hospital Alpenhof at Tegernsee, a small town in the Bavarian Alps, southeast of Munich. Morell spent his final 11 months at the Tegernsee hospital, a shadow of the man who had once wielded such influence. His wife Johanna visited when she could, though their relationship had long resembled a one-way street. His letters to her often unanswered during the years when he was constantly at Hitler's side. The contrast between his present circumstances and his former status could not have been starker. Just 3 years earlier, he had been injecting the most powerful man in Europe, influencing military conferences by his control over the Führer's energy and alertness, amassing wealth through pharmaceutical contracts with the armed forces. Now he lay in a provincial hospital bed, barely able to speak, waiting for the end. The former assistant who knew him best described his death as being like a stray dog. So on 26 May 1948, Theodor Morell died of a stroke at the age of 61. The immediate cause was consistent with his documented medical conditions, including hypertension and prior cardiac episodes. He had lived almost exactly 3 years after the regime he served collapsed into rubble. The medical diaries Morell kept throughout his years treating Hitler survived the war and became invaluable historical documents. British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, whose 1947 book, The Last Days of Hitler, established the definitive early account of the bunker's final weeks, drew heavily on information from those records. Trevor Roper had been tasked by British intelligence with determining whether Hitler was truly dead, and Morell's diary provided crucial details about the Führer's physical and mental condition in the final months. The German writer David Irving later published an edited version of the diaries as The Secret Diaries of Hitler's Doctor in 1983. More recently, Norman Ohler's 2015 book Blitzed: Drugs in the Third Reich brought renewed attention to Morell's role in creating Hitler's drug dependency, arguing that methamphetamine use permeated the Nazi war machine from top to bottom. Though some academic historians have criticized the work for sensationalism and overstatement, it sparked fresh public interest in a chapter of the Nazi story that had long remained in the shadows. The debate over how much Morell's treatments contributed to Hitler's erratic behavior during the war continues among historians and medical professionals. Some argue that the combination of methamphetamines, opioids, and other substances created a chemical dependency that warped Hitler's judgment at critical moments. Others contend that Hitler's ideology and worldview were firmly established long before Morell became his physician, and that the drugs, while damaging to his health, did not fundamentally alter his decision-making. The physicians, Henrik Eberle and Hans-Joachim Neumann, who conducted an exhaustive review of the available evidence, concluded in their 2012 book, Was Hitler Ill?, that while Hitler suffered from genuine chronic ailments, including gastrointestinal problems and Parkinson's disease, the evidence for severe drug addiction is less clear-cut than popular accounts suggest. What is beyond dispute is that Morell occupied a unique position in the Nazi hierarchy. He was not a true believer, not a military commander, not a political operative. He was simply a physician who recognized an opportunity and exploited it ruthlessly. His motivations appear to have been primarily financial rather than ideological. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933 not out of conviction but because it was professionally advantageous to do so. He cultivated his relationship with Hitler not to advance Nazi goals but to enrich himself. In this sense, Morell represents a type that proliferated throughout the Third Reich. The opportunist who attached himself to power without deeply examining what that power was being used to accomplish. His access to Hitler was unmatched. He accompanied the Führer to military headquarters, to the Berghof, to the bunker, observing moments of private vulnerability that few others ever witnessed. He saw Hitler. In the morning before the first injection brought him back to apparent vitality. He saw the deterioration that each passing month accelerated, and he kept records, page after page of prescriptions and observations that provide one of the most detailed windows into the physical collapse of the man who plunged the world into war. Morell's pharmaceutical empire did not survive him, but his wife Johanna lived until 2nd July 1983, dying of heart failure at the age of 85 in the Hamburg villa her husband had purchased in 1940. The medical records Morell carried out of Berlin are now scattered across archives in Munich, Koblenz, and Washington, studied by researchers seeking to understand both Hitler's final years and the broader culture of drug use in Nazi Germany. The Tegernsee hospital where he died has undergone many changes in the decades since. The name Theodor Morell has faded from public memory, overshadowed by the more prominent figures of the Nazi regime whose crimes commanded attention at Nuremberg and in the decades of historical reckoning that followed. Yet the story of Hitler's personal doctor offers its own lessons about the nature of power, the corrupting influence of proximity to authority, and the moral compromises that enable evil. Morell was not a monster in the conventional sense. He committed no atrocities with his own hands. He did not design concentration camps or order mass executions. He did not formulate the policies of racial persecution that defined the Nazi regime. But he attached himself to a regime of unprecedented criminality, profited from its conquests, acquired businesses seized from persecuted minorities, and administered substances that may have contributed to the prolonged suffering of millions, by helping sustain a dictator whose continued functioning prolonged a catastrophic war. The question of complicity, of what it means to serve evil without directly perpetrating it, finds uncomfortable expression in his career. His fate after 1945, the imprisonment, the interrogation, the lonely death in a provincial hospital, was a gentle conclusion compared to what befell his most famous patient, or the millions who perished in the war that patient unleashed. Today, few physical traces remain of Morell's life or career. The Berlin practice on the Kurfürstendamm was destroyed in the bombing. The villa on Schwanenwerder Island was later purchased by media magnate Axel Springer. The factories in Moravia and the Sudetenland were nationalized and eventually forgotten. Only the documents survive, the diaries and interrogation transcripts and medical analyses, preserving the record of a physician who achieved extraordinary access to one of history's most destructive figures, and used that access primarily to enrich himself. In the end, Morell's legacy is inseparable from the questions that continue to surround his patient. How much did the drugs affect Hitler's judgment? How much did the treatments hasten his decline? And what might have been different if a different doctor had stood at the Führer's side? The answers remain elusive, debated by historians and medical experts who return again and again to Morell's meticulous records. What is clear is that for nearly 9 years, a man dismissed by his contemporaries as a quack, mocked for his hygiene and his reliance on injections, remained indispensable to the leader of Nazi Germany. That relationship ended only when Hitler, in a final burst of paranoid rage, drove his physician away. 8 days later, Hitler was dead. 3 years after that, so was Morell. Their fates, intertwined for so long, reached their separate conclusions in the rubble of everything they had built. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Hitler's Bunker After WW2. Next, a look at how the Third Reich's final command post was demolished, buried, and eventually marked with nothing more than a small information board above a parking lot. Like this. Video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.